Story number 1. The Silent Guest. In the winter of 1989, Lena inherited a secluded farmhouse deep in the woods of Maine. The property came from a distant uncle she barely remembered, an eccentric man who died under mysterious circumstances. Desperate for a fresh start after a messy divorce, Lena saw it as a sign, a chance to rebuild her life away from the chaos of the city. The house was a sprawling, weathered structure, its once proud white paint peeling to reveal gray, rotting wood beneath. Bare oak trees surrounded it, their gnarled branches clawing at the overcast sky. When she arrived, a chilling wind howled through the broken shutters, and the air smelled faintly of mold and decay. Still, there was a strange charm to the place. Inside, Lena found dusty furniture, ornate woodwork, and faded wallpaper adorned with intricate patterns of ivy. It felt timeless, like a snapshot of a bygone era. But as she explored, she noticed oddities, scratches on the floorboards, heavy locks on several interior doors, and an attic door at the end of the upstairs hall that wouldn't budge, no matter how hard she pushed. That first night, the house introduced itself. As Lena unpacked, she heard faint footsteps above her, slow and deliberate. She froze, listening. A squirrel in the attic, maybe. The sound stopped. She tried to dismiss it and went back to work. But just as she was drifting off to sleep in her new bed, the footsteps began again, pacing. She lay paralyzed, staring at the darkened ceiling until they stopped. The next morning, determined to prove to herself it was nothing, Lena climbed the creaking attic stairs. The door resisted at first, but a hard shove finally sent it groaning open. Inside, the air was thick and musty, and sunlight filtered through cracked slats in the roof. The room was empty except for a trunk shoved against the far wall. It was locked tight, but what caught her eye was the writing scratched into the wooden floorboards beneath it. "Keep it closed." She slammed the attic door shut and didn't go back. Over the next few days, the house seemed to come alive. Objects shifted positions when Lena wasn't looking. Her toothbrush moved from the bathroom sink to the kitchen counter. A chair she had tucked neatly under the dining table was left pulled out. And every night, she heard the footsteps above her, pacing endlessly. One evening, as a storm raged outside, Lena tried to distract herself with an old book she'd found on the shelves, but the pages seemed wrong. Blank where words should have been, the ink faded to invisibility. Frustrated, she set it down and turned toward the fireplace. That's when she saw it. In the reflection of the window beside her, a figure stood at the top of the stairs. Its shape was indistinct, as if it were made of smoke, but its head tilted unnaturally, as though studying her. Lena spun around. Nothing was there. She barely slept that night, clutching a kitchen knife under her blankets. The next morning, desperate for answers, Lena called the lawyer who had handled the inheritance. His voice dropped when she mentioned the farmhouse. "Didn't your uncle warn you?" he asked. "Warn me about what?" Lena demanded. The lawyer hesitated. "Your uncle. He wasn't well. Said there was something in the house. Something that watched him. He wouldn't even go into the attic the last few years before he died." Lena hung up, her heart racing. She decided to leave. But as she packed her things, she found herself drawn back to the attic. The pacing footsteps were louder now, echoing down the stairs as if daring her to come closer. This time, when she opened the attic door, the trunk wasn't against the far wall. It was in the center of the room, as though it had been dragged there. The lock had broken, and the lid hung slightly ajar. Inside, Lena found photographs, black and white images of her uncle standing with strangers, all of them gathered in front of the farmhouse. But the faces of the strangers were blurred, like smudges of ink. At the bottom of the trunk, there was a journal. The last entry, written in shaky handwriting, read, "It won't let me go. It's always watching. Don't open the door." A sudden crash downstairs made Lena drop the journal. She ran back down, heart pounding, and found the front door wide open, snow swirling in. And in the doorway stood the figure. This time, it wasn't just smoke. Its body was pale and translucent, its face featureless except for two hollow eyes that seemed to pull light into their depths. It moved toward her, its footsteps heavy now, thudding against the floor. Lena bolted for her car, but as she fumbled with the keys, she heard whispers behind her, low, guttural, and in a language she didn't understand. She dared to glance back and saw the figure standing in the window of the attic, watching her as she sped away. She never returned to the farmhouse. Months later, she learned it had burned to the ground in a freak accident. No cause was ever determined. But Lena's nightmares continue. She dreams of the attic, the trunk, and the figure's hollow eyes. And sometimes, when she's alone, she hears it, the faint sound of footsteps pacing above her ceiling. Story number 2. The Watcher in the Woods. In the fall of 1996, a small town in Oregon was rocked by the disappearance of a teenage boy named Josh Harper. He was last seen riding his bike home from a friend's house late one evening, cutting through the dense woods that bordered the town. Search parties combed the forest for weeks, but no trace of him was ever found. The town moved on, as towns do, but stories began to circulate among the kids who lived near the woods. They spoke in hushed tones about the Watcher, a figure they claimed could be seen lurking between the trees at dusk. Parents dismissed it as an urban legend, a way for kids to spook each other. But one family, the Parkers, would learn the truth. The Parkers had recently moved to town. Their daughter Emily was 11, curious, adventurous, and fiercely independent. The woods fascinated her. She spent hours exploring them, collecting odd-shaped rocks and colorful leaves. Her parents warned her not to go too far, but Emily always pushed the boundaries. One afternoon, Emily came home pale and shaken. "Someone was in the woods," she told her mother. "Probably just a hiker," her mom replied, brushing it off. But Emily shook her head. "He was watching me. He didn't move. He just stared." Her mother frowned but didn't press the issue. Emily was known for her imagination, after all. That night, Emily woke up to the sound of tapping on her bedroom window. She lived on the second floor. Terrified, she stayed under her blanket until morning. When she finally mustered the courage to look, she found long, thin scratches running down the glass, as though something sharp had dragged across it. She told her parents, but they dismissed it as tree branches scraping in the wind. Emily knew better. In the days that followed, the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. She would glance out the window and catch glimpses of a figure standing at the edge of the woods, tall and impossibly thin, its body seeming to blur with the shadows around it. Every time she blinked, it was gone. Emily stopped going into the woods. She stopped sleeping with the lights off. One evening, as her father worked late and her mother was busy in the kitchen, Emily heard a noise from upstairs, a soft, deliberate creak, as if someone was walking down the hall. "Mom?" she called, but there was no answer. Clutching a flashlight, Emily crept upstairs. Her bedroom door was ajar, and the air inside felt colder than the rest of the house. On her desk was a pile of the rocks and leaves she had collected from the woods, items she knew she had thrown away weeks ago. And then she saw it. A figure crouched in the far corner of her room, its body impossibly long and angular. Its face, or what passed for a face, was smooth and featureless, except for two deep, sunken pits where eyes should have been. Emily screamed and bolted down the stairs. Her mother ran to her, but by the time they returned to the room, it was empty. The next day, the Parkers called the police, but no evidence of an intruder was found. They decided it was time to leave. As they packed, Emily noticed something strange. Every photo taken since they moved into the house showed the same figure lurking in the background, sometimes in the trees, sometimes just outside a window. The family moved out within a week, but Emily's nightmares persisted. Years later, long after she had left Oregon, she received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was one of the rocks she had collected from the woods, its surface scratched with the single word, "Come." Story number 3. A vanishing room. In 2012, a couple, Aaron and Sophie, bought a century-old townhouse in a quiet neighborhood of Charleston, South Carolina. The home was an architectural gem, boasting high ceilings, ornate crown molding, and intricate stained glass windows. It was perfect, almost too perfect. During the final walkthrough, their real estate agent made an offhand comment. "There's a lot of history in this house. Families have come and gone, but it's held up remarkably well." Aaron and Sophie didn't think much of it. They moved in 2 weeks later, eager to start their new life. But from the first night, Sophie felt something was off. While unpacking in the upstairs hallway, she noticed a door she didn't remember seeing during their tours. It was small, with chipped white paint and a tarnished brass knob. Thinking it might be an old storage closet, Sophie tried to open it, but the knob wouldn't turn. "Aaron, did you see this door before?" she called. Aaron glanced over. "Nope, Probably just a crawl space. We can check it out later." They didn't. Over the next few days, the door seemed to nag at Sophie's mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't belong there. One morning, she tried the knob again, and to her surprise, it turned easily. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. Dust motes hung in the air, and the wooden floor creaked beneath her feet. The walls were bare except for a single object, a tall antique mirror in a gilded frame, leaning against the far wall. Sophie felt uneasy but chalked it up to the house's age. She shut the door and went about her day. That night, she woke to a faint tapping noise. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and coming from the hallway. "Aaron, do you hear that?" Aaron groaned, half asleep. "It's an old house, Soph. Houses creak." But Sophie wasn't convinced. She got up and opened the bedroom door. The tapping stopped instantly. The hallway was empty, but the small door at the end was slightly ajar. The next morning, Sophie mentioned it to Aaron. He brushed it off until they went upstairs together, and the door wasn't there. "What are you talking about?" Aaron said, staring at the smooth wall where the door had been. "It was right here," Sophie insisted. Aaron laughed nervously. "Maybe you were dreaming." Sophie didn't argue, but deep down she knew she wasn't imagining things. That evening, Aaron stayed late at work, and Sophie was alone in the house. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with an unexplainable tension. She tried to focus on a book, but her attention kept drifting to the hallway. Finally, she decided to prove to herself that the door had been real. Armed with a flashlight, she marched upstairs. And there it was again. The small door stood where she remembered it, as though it had never disappeared. Trembling, Sophie opened it. The room looked the same as before, dusty, empty, and dominated by the mirror. But this time, something was different. The reflection in the mirror didn't match the room. In the mirror, the walls were covered in dark stains that looked like dried blood, and shadows flickered across the surface as if something was moving just out of view. Sophie stepped closer, her breath fogging the glass. That's when she saw herself in the reflection, except it wasn't her. The figure wore her face but moved independently, staring back with cold, lifeless eyes. Its lips twisted into a malevolent grin and mouthed two words, "Get out." Sophie stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. She didn't sleep that night. When Aaron came home, she told him everything. He was skeptical, but agreed to humor her. Together, they went upstairs to find the door again. It was gone. Days turned into weeks, and Sophie became obsessed. She scoured old property records and learned the townhouse had a dark past. In the early 1900s, a series of disappearances had been linked to the house. Tenants would vanish without a trace, leaving all their belongings behind. The only clue: each family reported seeing a mysterious door appear in the house shortly before they disappeared. Aaron, worried for Sophie's mental health, suggested they sell the house, but Sophie couldn't let it go. She began staying up late, waiting for the door to reappear. One night, it did. Sophie didn't wake Aaron. She couldn't explain why, but she felt drawn to the door, as though it were calling her. She opened it one last time. Aaron woke the next morning to find Sophie gone. Her car was still in the driveway, her purse on the kitchen counter, but she was nowhere to be found. The police searched the house and surrounding area, but there was no trace of her. The only oddity was a small door in the upstairs hallway, sealed shut and painted over. Aaron swore it had never been there before. To this day, Sophie's disappearance remains unsolved. The townhouse has since been resold, and new owners live there now. But every so often, neighbors say they see a faint light glowing from the upstairs hallway, and on quiet nights, some swear they hear faint tapping, like someone trying to get out.